Welcoming to the show, David Ubben, who covers college football for theathletic.com, has followed Tennessee more closely in the last few years as well. David, we appreciate you joining us. Great to have you back on the show. And we started this show, or at least early on, we discussed the college football playoff with the 5+7 format getting a lot of attention the last couple of days. And then yesterday, talk of a 14-team playoff. What about 16 has already come up in the college football playoff meetings. What do you think with the 5+7 format that's official now, and then the idea of expansion that could occur here in the next couple of years?
Well, the underlying reason for the 5-7 format is a little bit, it's sort of sad. It's the last little piece of fallout from the death of the Pac-12. Necessary. I think it was always going to go this way as of, last summer. You just sort of had to be unanimous. I think everybody recognized that that's what had to happen. As for, bracket creep, we've been warning people about this for years. I don't think I thought we would open the conversation before the 12 team even happened. But the reality is there's too much money to be made. And I think it's the same thing, similar thing with the bracket creep for the NCAA tournament basketball of like, hey, what if we played more of these games? And nobody particularly wants it, but my golden rule of realignment and basically anything else in college sports is, if it makes sense, CENTS, it makes sense, SCNSE, and that's where we're at. And especially now where people are looking down the pipes at the future of college sports and, you see employment, you see revenue sharing, they need other sources of money, and, an expanded playoff is one place to get that. So I think that some of that is fueling a lot of this, but ultimately, basically any decision that has happened in college sports in the last 20 years that has been intensely unpopular, follow the money, and it becomes understandable in a hurry.
David, where do you stand? If you had two choices right now, 12-team playoff, but you had two choices, either go backwards to BCS or go forward to 14, where would you stand on that?
Can I go 8? Am I allowed to go 8?
You gotta go all the way back to go, like what's that, Monopoly?
Yeah,
go all the way back to BCS.
I tried to go to a 6 or 8 team format, and Swain wouldn't let me do that earlier in the show. So the answer for you is going to be no as well. If I couldn't, you couldn't either.
Well, okay, so this is sort of a complicated question because I am not the target consumer. I'm going to watch all of this regardless. Will the 14 or 16 team, will that hurt your regular season ratings? I would say probably. Well, I don't think it will hurt the excitement for those games among the people that really care, but the casual fans will say, I don't care about Michigan, Penn State, I'll tune in January. I could see that happening. I think that will hurt you a little bit. But I think for me, and not everybody agrees with me on this, but I feel like the trump card of all of this is it is deeply un-American and against everything that I believe in sports, that you can start a season and you can just say, hey, for 60 or so of you guys, even if you win all of your games, you don't get to play for a championship. That's garbage. And that has infuriated me as long as I've been following this sport. So I guess for that reason, I would lean more toward the 14 to 16 just because, like the idea that, a Liberty or a UCF or whoever can win all their games and not even get a chance to prove whether or not they belong is so infuriating to me. That Cincinnati needed an act of God to get in the playoff, despite the fact that they beat Notre Dame on their home field and beat the crap out of a bunch of other teams. So I guess for that reason, I would go for the expanded playoff.
David Ubben, theathletic.com, is with us, covers college football. Speaking of topics that can infuriate people, the NCAA. Tennessee is in its battle with the NCAA right now. We're still waiting for Judge Corker's ruling. You've written about the case that's taking place and the NCAA looking into Tennessee as well as other schools. What do you make of where things are as we're kind of waiting on a court ruling?
I think it's been pretty clear. I think if you're looking at, okay, did Tennessee or its collective break the rules that the NCAA will call them guidelines? I think it's open for debate. It's sort of like, well, how do we interpret the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law? Clearly broke the spirit of the law like a lot of other teams did. The letter of the law, probably not. But then the trump card of that is, well, these rules are stupid anyway. You're going to lose in court eventually. I think the judge has alluded to this So I think the fact that these rules will be unenforceable in not short order feels like a question of when, not if. So the latter question of whether or not they broke these rules that won't exist will be sort of irrelevant. It's an interesting discussion, but I think it's one that won't ultimately matter because I think we're headed towards a place where until you can get to a place where there's collective bargaining and players, coaches, administrators can get in the room and say, okay, here's a set of rules that we agree on that are fair for everybody, that everybody can live with. You might not get everything, but let's sit in a room and hash this out. Until you can get to that place, which is going to be a while, you're going to be in this place where there are no rules because you can't enforce any rules until you get everybody in the same room and come up with a rule book that both sides can sit down and agree to. Because right now, it's pretty simple. If you have a rule that's enforced upon you that you don't like, you can go to court because basically every rule the NCAA has around around NIL, around the eligibility issue, around all these things is not going to hold up in court. And so, it is what it is. I think it's also worth noting that let's just have a reminder as well, the NCAA, not a faceless organization in a dark tower. The NCAA is the schools. The schools wrote all these rules. They agreed to all these rules. There's a lot of weird, politics in play in terms of the sizes of the schools that are on the rulemaking committee. But these are the rules that everybody agreed to. Now, they are almost certainly illegal in violation of the Sherman Act. I think they will not hold up in court. But I think there's still this prevailing idea that, the NCAA is putting down these laws that everybody hates. And the schools, people have been screaming for more NIL enforcement since the NIL issue started. It's people breaking these rules, and the NCAA enforces it, and people, well, not us. Don't enforce it on us. Enforce it on our rivals. That's what we were wanting. And so, this is where we are. But ultimately, I think we're going to get to a place in the immediate future where there are no rules that are enforceable because you will just go to court and win. But I think you've got to get to a place where you have a rule book that is made in concert with all of the parties involved.
A part of me feels like Charlie Baker knew what was going to happen if they came after Tennessee. That Tennessee was going to fight back. And I feel like this will just accelerate maybe some rules being put in place. It just feels like they knew that Tennessee would fight back. It almost feels like that they want to lose in court. Am I off base there a little bit?
Maybe. I think you have to, at some point, whether that was last year, whether that was this year, whether it was 2 years, at some point, there was going to have to be some attempted enforcement of the NIL rules, and somebody was going to take it to court.
Yeah.
It was going to have to be someone or something. And the NCAA membership has been pushing for, we need more enforcement, we need more enforcement, we need more enforcement. It's the same thing with the waiver issue. Everybody wants waivers. The coaches, players, we need fewer waivers. We don't like this process. We need fewer waivers. And then when your guy doesn't get a waiver, well, this process is messed up. We're killing the kids. So what happened to you 9 months ago when you were saying this waiver process stinks? We need either just one free transfer and that's it. Well, what about this special case? What about this special case? So there's a level of hypocrisy in all this. So I think ultimately people wanted enforcement, but with that enforcement, whoever got hit was going to kick back, and the courts kind of have to decide this. Now, I think the judge has alluded to it. I'm not a lawyer, but my basic understanding of all these cases, I think that the AG's case is, it's not a slam dunk, but I'd put it at 90% that they probably win this. That might even be low. So you're going to win that. And then the outcome of that in the immediate future is there's basically no NIL rules. I think the NCAA recognized this. And the one thing that I will give Charlie Baker credit for is that unlike his predecessors, I don't think that he is living in a fantasy world. I think he is understanding of, hey, things are going to have to change. We're going to have to move to a place that makes more sense. The idea that the NCAA president could publicly endorse the idea of schools directly paying players, even if it's in this sort of weird trust fund thing that I don't think will ultimately hold up or that anybody ultimately wants, that was a pretty revolutionary idea. Not in general, but coming from the NCAA office, from the NCAA president, that's something that we've never heard before in the history of college sports. So I think in that sense, at least he is not ignorant of the realities that the organization, the future of college sports face. But I agree with you. I think he would be naive to think that it wasn't going to get pushed in court. But at some point, this was going to have to happen. You had to try to enforce it, and then it was going to go to court, and we'll see how it plays out.
David Ubben, who covers college football for The Athletic. While we have talks of court cases and big picture rule changes. There will be games played on the field this fall as well. You saw Nico make his first college start for Tennessee against Iowa in the Citrus Bowl. What did you think of what you saw? How does that affect your thoughts on Tennessee's potential for 2024?
I mean, I was pretty impressed. I think ultimately this is a very, very quarterback-friendly offense. We've seen that. We have, 12 years of data in this offense that a lot of quarterbacks can kill it. And when you get elite talent and super athletic guys like a Brew McCoy in this offense, you can set some things on fire. And so I think it's definitely an exciting time. I think there's a ton of potential there. I don't think you saw what you would have liked to have seen from Joe Milton in 2023, but there's a lot of explanation for that. You're obviously replacing a ton, but when all of your weapons get hurt, more or less, and you lose a guy like Jalen Hyde and Cedric Tillman, and Brew McCoy goes down, and Dante Thornton isn't quite what you thought he was going to be, at least immediately. When you don't have a guy to take the top off the defense, that's tough for this offense. The whole thing is built around forcing defenses to cover the whole field. So if you get maybe a little bit more accurate quarterback that's maybe a little bit better decision making, and some more speed at receivers, I think this offense has a chance to look a lot more like 2022 next year than it did in 2023.
David, you covered Big 12, and you saw Art Browse tear up the Big 12 when he was at Baylor. When did he have trouble offensively? When did defenses had success against Baylor during your time covering the Big 12?
So this cycle is actually really, really interesting because I have some questions about this offense in general, big picture in the sport. We can say that for another conversation. But it was sort of a cycle, right? So when he first got to Baylor, they really didn't have a lot of great players at all. You had a very, very young RG3 pretty quickly. David Geddes, if you remember him back in the day, Jason Smith, the guy that was drafted number 2 overall and did do a lot in the NFL, was a great offensive lineman. It was sort of like, okay, the scheme was giving people trouble when they really didn't have great athletes. And then you got toward year 5 and 6 when they had that, back-to-back Big 12 championships. Then they had they didn't have the depth of Texas and Oklahoma, but their top 22 were just as good. Mm-hmm. Where they got into trouble is basically if you have DBs that can run at an elite level and you have defensive lines that can rush for and get pressure and stop the run. That's where it gets really, really sticky for these kinds of offenses. But if you have better athletes than the defense and you have this scheme, you're going to put up 60 points. We've seen that for 10, 12 years in this offense. That just happens. I mean, the amount of times that Baylor went up against somebody that was overmatched and put up 28 points in the first quarter, I mean, it happened a million times. We saw Tennessee do it a handful of times to teams that were just not prepared for this offense. I think my question is, if you look around at the dozen, 12, 15 programs in the country that are running this offense, defenses have caught up a little bit. Now, you still have to have the athletes. You still have to have the ability to stop the run without having to need 6 or 7 guys to do that. But I think there's some things I have some questions about are people understand the keys of this offense, and are they making those keys lie to them? We'll make it look like a white box, and then post snap, you're stacking the box quick. You're rushing guys in there, using their keys against them. I don't know the answer to this question. That's for something I need to do in research in the future. But in short, to answer your question, big defensive linemen that can stop the run with 4 and 5 guys, which is not a lot of teams, and defensive backs that can run. And we saw that, Georgia gave Tennessee fits 2 years ago. Keely Ringo and those guys were giving them a tough time. But, Tennessee, if you look around the SEC, I mean, how many teams have better athletes in their top 22 than Tennessee? It's 3, 4, 5 teams maybe. So I think the thing that you have seen with this offense, and you've seen with Tennessee, is that when they're significantly better than teams, there's no fooling around. They put the smack down pretty quickly. Yeah. And that, I think, is one of the biggest assets of this offense and this scheme in general, is you don't see a lot of upsets with this because this scheme is so lethal when you have better players.
Last thing, Dave, you wrote a story on Jennings. There was a Tennessee fan in South Carolina that named her daughter Jennings, and Jawan Jennings had a great Super Bowl performance, came up a little bit short, but I mean, that article certainly was worth bringing back up and reading because of Jawan's performance in Super Bowl. Walk us through a little bit about how that article came together.
So I don't remember who told me. I found out about it pretty quickly in the middle of I guess it was the 19 season. I can't remember. But, I knew I was the only person that had it. And I waited until the media elbowed or whatever had broken up. I will never forget the look on Jawan's face when I explained to him what had happened. Like, he this, like, gigantic smile. Like, Jawan, one of the best guys I've covered. He just, like, he runs hot. And when you can channel that into a productive place, you get some really good results. And I think he's a guy that played with so much intensity and so much joy, which I think it gets a little bit overlooked in how he played. But that was a guy that, could not be – I mean, he thought it was like the coolest thing he'd ever heard. And it's a pretty interesting story in general. But it was cool to see him get that moment on the big stage. And, there were 20, 30 minutes in there where we were talking about is Juwan Jennings about to win Super Bowl MVP? That is wild. So we'll see what his future holds. I'll be interested to see if he can go to a place where he's more of a featured player in an offense. But he, from what I understand, San Francisco loves him. He's, when he's been called upon, he has really answered the bell there, and he did that, in quite a few ways. I think he, it's interesting in that Super Bowl, he was a higher rated recruit than Brock Purdy and Patrick Mahomes. But the highest rated recruit in that game was actually Blake Bell, former Oklahoma quarterback, a.k.a. the Belldozer, a.k.a. the Chiefs' fifth string tight end. So the NFL is a weird place. You never know how it's going to play out for you.
Yeah, when you throw in old recruiting rankings into the NFL teams, you come up with endless storylines. There are several timeless Tennessee stories that you can go back and read during the offseason. We'll fill some gaps for you if you're a Tennessee fan. David Ubben has written them, continues to cover the sport of college football. David, thanks so much for giving us the time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
David Ubben of The Athletic joining us right here on Josh and Swain. We'll continue.